Children of villages, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on wherever you're watching. It's your Pop Flyalert here as usual. And if this is your first time, before we start, at the count of 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, subscribe and be part of this sons of family as we are going forward. So today, guys, I want to do the challenge. About the challenge is that I want to do the challenge of 5 good errors. So what we want to do in these 5 good errors is that we want to say subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Right? Have you subscribed to this YouTube channel? Kindly do so if you haven't. So guys, without much ado, let's jump into the challenge. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. I'm struggling, guys, but it is what it is. You know, English is our native language. So sometimes the tongue can just go AY. Anyway, subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. 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 Subscribe, 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 subscribe. 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 Subscribe, 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 subscribe. 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 So, guys, it's kind of crazy. You know, here in the village, when you see there is a lady there that is seeing me and is laughing. So here in the village, it's kind of strange to really see somebody talking to himself or to herself in the phone or filming, because it's kind of strange. People doesn't even understand what is going on. It seems like it's strange, so somebody can say, what happened to this guy? He's kind of mentally handicapped. Anyway, guys, it is what it is. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. 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 Subscribe, 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 subscribe. 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 It's kind of strange, guys. Can you see behind me here? There is a lady there also. He's got a tattoo, that one now. It was wondering what's going on. It's start a little bit. Anyway, let's go. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. 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 I'm struggling, I don't know why. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. 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 Look at the situation, guys. It's kind of strange. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. 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 Subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, 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 subscribe. Oh guys, right now it's 12:36 East African time. The sun is on top notch, as you can see how the lighting is, right? Alright guys, we're still going on with our challenge. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. As I've already said, that 5 hours is not a joke. Subscribe, 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 and 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 subscribe, 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 and subscribe, and subscribe, and subscribe, and subscribe, and subscribe, and subscribe, 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 and subscribe, and subscribe, and subscribe. I want to say thank you guys for subscribing. This is the end of our challenge, and as you all know that how hot it is, even though we are in the middle of tree plantation right here, it's kind of cool, not cool, it's kind of warm, not warm, it's 50-50. Anyway, I want to say thank you for those who subscribe. If this is your first time watching me, kind of do so, right? As we have already done the challenge, and I'll be so grateful. At the same time, also feeling joy at the same time. Right, guys? Let me not talk too much. Right now it's 12. And it's 18 time here. It normally rain here in East Africa, especially here right now. We're experiencing something called El Nino. Have you ever heard about El Nino? Anyway, guys, no way, bro. That's freezing, man. Wow, that's nice. Wow, no way. Alright guys, let me just end this video here guys. I love you all, including everybody. Don't forget to subscribe, right? Let's do this challenge, and I believe going forward we will have a aim of 5,000 subscribers before the end of this year. That's my aim, and that's what I told God in my new resolution. Alright guys, I love you all, including everybody. Peace. Let's meet on the next video.